Welcome back to Viewpoint. We'll now get into this border protection issue that's been traumatising our nation for the past couple of years. And I've joined by the new Immigration Minister Tony Burke, live from Canberra. Thanks for joining us, Minister.
Good to be with you, Chris.
Look, it is hard to keep up with these things, but I've been looking through the press releases today and it seems like you've announced the arrival of 3 more boats today with just over 300 more asylum seekers on board. With this constant arrival of boats, would you concede now that the problem is actually out of control? There is nothing stemming the flow?
Oh, the problem is much, much greater than it was a few years ago. There's no doubt about that.
Well, there is no sign then that any of the measures you've put in place, of course you've gone to some offshore processing now and there's been some information campaigns run overseas. There are no signs at all that any of this is slowing the arrival of boats?
The challenge has always been you need to have a regional solution or a regional approach that's big enough to deal with the scale of the problem. So I have no doubt at the time that Malaysia was originally announced that with Nauru and with Manus Island was actually sufficiently proportionate to be able to deal with the scale of what the problem was like then. The truth is now the challenge is much greater, and that's why whatever new regional approach is forged out of the meetings that are likely to be hosted out of Indonesia, we will now need something Malaysia original plus more to be able to deal with the scale of what's now a much bigger problem.
Well, can you confirm then that your current policy is that under no circumstances the Australian government will turn back boats to Indonesia? You just won't contemplate that option?
That's correct.
So does that mean that when our vessels intercept, we like to use the word intercept, but it seems a little bit incorrect in these circumstances because often the boats call out to be met by our vessels, but when our customs or navy vessels actually intercept these asylum seeker boats, they don't even suggest to the captains that perhaps they shouldn't be heading to Australia, they should turn around and go back to their Indonesian port?
Okay, at this one, and I don't want to play demarcation games, but as you'd appreciate, everything that you're describing now is dealt with the Customs and Justice portfolio. And I can give you general government responses, but I mean, you want something more in depth than lines on this program.
Well, no, I just want to get to the heart of this issue. If you're saying you won't turn back boats and no effort is made to do it, then that's effectively what our Navy and Customs vessels are doing. They're not going out there and even trying to convince these boats to go back to their Indonesian home ports. They're just meeting them, greeting them and bringing them into Australia.
Yeah, and look, at this point, Chris, I mean, we can spend the interview on someone else's portfolio if you want. I don't dispute that it's a significant issue, but as you'd appreciate, as Minister for Immigration, when people arrive in Australia, it's at that point that they become my responsibility. Jason Clare's been out in the media today. He's the person who has responsibility for those parts of the operation. If I'd been in the portfolio for more than a week, I'd probably be able to help you with that level of detail. I can give you over... Yeah, I just don't think you want me to just throw a whole lot of government lines when you're asking questions of very specific detail.
No, but you are the Immigration Minister and you have held the portfolio previously in opposition, and back then you said that at some occasions there should be the opportunity to turn back boats. I just wanted to confirm with you that there's not even any effort at the moment. We don't even suggest to these boats, on the off chance we might be able to convince them to go back, that they should go back. We just meet and greet them.
And what I'm telling you is, if you want a blanket guarantee that something never happens, I can't give you that. What I certainly can tell you, Chris, is there are 2 differences now, from now to back when boats were turned around by the Howard government. 2 circumstances which, when we came to the election in 2007, we weren't across and hadn't been briefed on. The first was the capacity of the vessels that were being intercepted to immediately convert themselves into a safety at sea operation. And what that meant effectively was the sabotaging of the vessel, so that you then had a circumstance of, are you expecting an Australian crew to leave people in the water? That was the first thing that had changed actually during the Howard government years, and was why for a long time when they intercepted they'd stopped turning people around. The other thing that's changed is we now have very clear and public statements from the Indonesian government about their view on it. So when people say, well, John Howard back then didn't talk to the Indonesian government about sending vessels back, that was at a time when Indonesia had not made clear public statements to the contrary. So whether it's at the point of interception or whether it's when you get into Indonesian territory, you have a significant change now. And this is why I've always said, Chris, we need to make sure that our systems are tailored to the needs of Australia, but they need to be up to date, because people smugglers will always be finding loopholes. And just like people in tax law are always finding loopholes, and you need to update your approach on those laws, this is no different.
Well, the point is, you mentioned those two issues. The safety one we all know about, and that's why anybody who even advocates turning back boats says that it has to only be done in a situation where it can be done safely. But the other issue is critical, because Indonesia has never said they welcome boats being turned back, and you're telling us you won't turn back boats simply because Indonesia is making public statements about it. That seems to me that Indonesia is dictating our domestic policy.
Well, no. Chris, if we think through the logic of this, now that we have a situation where the operators turn it into a safety at sea operation, even Scott Morrison, okay, my opposition opponent, even Scott Morrison is now saying they won't tow boats to Indonesia. They're saying they'll tow them to effectively the edge.
No one has ever suggested that. They've suggested turning back boats around, so an Indonesian boat with an Indonesian crew is turned around and it sails itself back into its home Indonesian port. I don't see how Indonesia, in any circumstances, has any grounds to complain about that occurring.
Okay, so let's just follow the logic of this through. So if you're able to prevent them sabotaging the boat, you turn it around, you get to the edge of Indonesian territory and you're not willing to go beyond it. At that point you say to them, you're now on your own. At that moment they sabotage the vessel, and what happens? Even Scott Morrison concedes, you're back in a safety at sea situation. Well, you're right back logically where you started, and all you have achieved is used the resources of Australian Navy and Customs to tow boats around in circles around the Indian Ocean. Now, I can't for the life of me see how that is a serious practical response to a genuine regional problem.
Well, here's what former Rear Admiral Chris Ritchie said on ABC radio last week. He was a man who oversaw the Navy when it actually adopted this policy, confronting exactly the same issues.
Many of them was that there were only 4 that actually were successfully returned out of the 12. They did it a bit. You could see that they'd go around in circles. They might attempt to follow us, but in the end they turned back. And I think in the end, common sense and the safety of the crew and the passengers on board prevails, and they know that's what they have to do.
Why did the practice stop when it did?
No more boats came.
None at all?
None at all. None at all.
If that same model of returning boats was to be reinstituted today, do you think it would still work?
If the conditions were replicated, it could still work.
Minister Tony Burke, with that sort of record, why would you just take this option, this tactic, completely off the table?
Because of what was in that final grab that you played. The final comment there was if the conditions were replicated. And we know that the way the people smuggling boats operate now is fundamentally different. We know now the willingness and the organisation in advance to make sure that a vessel can be quickly vandalised so that it turns it into a safety at sea operation. You see, I don't have an argument with what you played in that interview, and I think the final comment in that interview is precisely why we have a different problem now, because the circumstances are not replicated. Nor would you expect people smugglers, if they're people wanting to break the law, they're hardly going to go back to an old model that they knew was able to beat them. They come up with new things, and what we need to be willing to do is not photocopy a policy from more than a decade ago. We need to be able to anticipate and match what these operators will do. And if we do that, we get in front of it. Photocopying will give you a great media release, and apparently it's provided some very good media lines, but I'm yet to see it stand up to any significant scrutiny.
So if safety is the concern, why do you keep going on about what Indonesia wants? Because this is obviously within Australia's right to do this. Indonesia could not complain about its own vessels going back. Why are you trying to turn this into some sort of diplomatic issue, as if Indonesia should be dictating who comes to this country?
Well, no, the only way of avoiding it being a safety at sea issue would be to tow the vessels all the way to Indonesia's shores. Indonesia say you can't do that, which is reasonable, it's their territory. Therefore, if you can only go to the edge of the territory, you're no better than where you started in their capacity of turning it into a safety at sea operation. Absolutely no better. Why would it be that the moment you say to the vessel, go off, that they don't turn it into a safety at sea operation if that was their original intention.
Well, so, I mean, you're confirming, we better move on to some of the other changes you're talking about, but you're confirming that because of those safety issues, those safety concerns, we don't even try to turn vessels back now. We don't even try and warn them off.
Well, no, right back to the earlier point, you asked me, can I give a blanket about what we never say? No, I can't. There are other ministers within the government responsible for those things who I have no doubt would be able to give you a direct answer. I'm not going to guess at an answer where you ask for something that's an absolute. I don't think you'd expect me to. But what you can do, and what I have done even in the first week as Minister, is where we can put people on a plane, and they certainly can't turn a plane into a safety at sea situation, and send them directly back to Sri Lanka. We've been doing that even in my first week as Minister. Yeah,
that has been successful. Now, you're also looking at the identity issue. We know that a lot of asylum seekers destroy their passports, their identification papers. In fact, most seem to do that these days, and you're saying that they'll now go to the back of the queue. Now, this is a policy that the Liberals announced 3 years ago. They suggested that this would be grounds to reject someone's refugee status, and that's they already have the power to do that under existing law. And you're sort of, the government, the Minister at the time, Chris Bowen, described that as a silly bit of politicking, but now you're adopting a very similar policy that doesn't go quite so far.
Well, I don't know how, I mean, I'll leave others to judge how similar it is. To my way of thinking on this is we have a very large number of people currently awaiting to be processed, and my view is you deal with the people who are being cooperative first. There will be some people, and I think we need to acknowledge this is a simple point of fact, there will be some people who come from countries where identity papers are not possible for them. That is certainly not the case across the board. There are some people where it applies to. There are also some people who arrive without identity papers, and once they're here, they actively help the Australian government in getting new papers for them from their source country. Now, those people wouldn't be disadvantaged. But for people who come without papers, who are not willing to cooperate in any way because they've destroyed the papers or for whatever reason, if they're not willing to cooperate, I can't for the life of me see why they should be processed ahead of people who will be cooperative.
Well, I mean, let's call a spade here. Foreign Minister Bob Carr says most of the asylum seekers arriving now are actually economic migrants, and the reason they would be destroying their identity papers would be because it would prove that they are not legitimate refugees. Is that not the case?
Bob Carr's comments referred to a number of recent boats, and the boats he was referring to were the boats where I've been putting people directly onto planes.
Tony Burke, just before I let you go, you're back in this portfolio, your first time in this portfolio in government now after the leadership change. You're the fourth Immigration Minister in 3 years. It's a very tough gig. Do you think Kevin Rudd gave it to you as punishment for the things you said about him at the time of the leadership challenge last year?
No, I don't. And Kevin knew I was perfectly happy to go to the backbench. Had I gone to the backbench, I wasn't going to give some grand media conference bagging him or anything like that. Kevin, I have to say, I think 3 years ago probably would have accepted a resignation from me. And he took me through the specific reasons as to why I knew the scale and the significance of the job, but he took me through specifically why he wanted me to do it. And faced with a conversation like that, I decided, well, you're here to make a difference. I've been asked to make a difference in something that's really hard and matters. I'm up for it.
Given you said at the time that the chaos and indecision in his government was true, the stories about that were true, are you convinced that there won't be the chaos and indecision with Kevin Rudd at the helm again now? You can work with him?
Certainly everything I've seen so far is completely different to what I had complained about 3 years ago.
Well, Immigration Minister Tony Burke, thanks for joining us tonight on Viewpoint.
Good to be with you, Chris.
And we would like to speak to the Home Affairs Minister, Jason Clare, about some of those issues at sea. So we have been trying to get him on the program. We'll keep trying and have a chat to him about those issues as well. In a moment, we'll talk to former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer, who's actually been at the helm while some of these boat turnbacks have occurred.